Somewhere in a government archive, there are thousands of pages that almost no one has ever read. Pages written by hand, in living rooms and on kitchen tables, during the final years of the 1930s. They contain something remarkable: the recorded memories of Americans who had been born before the Civil War. People who, as children, had watched the world they knew slowly catch fire and be replaced by something unrecognizable. These weren't myths or legends passed down through generations. They were first-hand accounts, real voices, and they described a version of American history that looked nothing like the one taught in schools. The question is, why? During the Great Depression, the United States government faced an unusual problem. Millions of Americans were unemployed, including thousands of writers, journalists, and academics. As part of a broader relief effort, those individuals were put to work on something that would turn out to be historically priceless. They were sent across the country with notebooks and a simple instruction: find the oldest people still living and write down everything they remember. The Federal Writers Project, as it came to be known, was not considered historically revolutionary at the time. It was practical. Administrators understood that an entire generation of Americans, people born in the 1850s and 1860s, was nearing the end of their lives. So, writers traveled to farmhouses in rural Ohio, to weathered homes in Mississippi, to small apartments in crowded city neighborhoods. They sat across from elderly men and women and listened for hours. What those writers recorded fills thousands of pages stored in archives today. And buried within those transcripts is something that historians have only recently begun to take seriously. These elderly witnesses didn't just describe ordinary life. They described a world that seemed to have undergone a transformation so rapid and so complete that later generations could barely imagine it. To understand why these testimonies matter, you first have to understand who these people were. A person born in 1856 would have spent their childhood in a country where most communities were small, isolated, and shaped entirely by the pace of horses and farming seasons. No electric light, no telephone, no engine loud enough to drown out the sound of the wind. By the time that same person reached their 40s, railroads had carved through every corner of the continent. Factories were drawing thousands of workers into cities. Stone buildings dozens of stories tall were rising along city blocks. And by the time they sat down to speak with a government writer in 1938, that same person was living in a world of automobiles, commercial radio, and transatlantic flight. The transformation was almost incomprehensible. In a single lifetime, the physical landscape of an entire civilization had changed beyond recognition. Many of them did not describe gradual progress. They described sudden transitions, cities that seemed to transform almost overnight, buildings that appeared in places that had held something very different only a decade before, disasters that struck not one town, but entire regions, within the same narrow window of time. And when their recollections are placed alongside official historical timelines, certain details are surprisingly difficult to reconcile. In October of 1871, something happened across the American Midwest that textbooks have never fully explained. Most people know about the Great Chicago Fire, a barn, a lantern, 2 days of destruction, that leveled thousands of buildings across one of America's fastest-growing cities. It became one of the most famous disasters in the country's history. But here is what most people were never told. Chicago was not the only place burning that night. On October 8, 1871, the same evening Chicago was engulfed in flames, a fire of far greater destruction swept through Peshtigo, Wisconsin. The Peshtigo fire killed more people than any wildfire in American recorded history. Survivors described not ordinary flames, but something far stranger. Fire that moved faster than a running horse, walls of heat that seemed to arrive before the visible blaze, winds that uprooted trees and carried burning debris across miles of open land. But it didn't stop there. That same night, towns in Michigan were also on fire. Holland burned. Manistee burned. Port Huron faced serious threat. Across 3 states, fires erupted. Simultaneously, Official explanations point to drought conditions and strong autumn winds. Those explanations are reasonable, but they don't fully account for the geographical breadth of the destruction, the near simultaneous ignition across such a wide area. Or children who survived that night carried the memory for the rest of their lives. Decades later, when government writers found those survivors as elderly citizens, they still spoke about it with the same quality of wonder and confusion. Something had changed after that night. The landscape they had grown up in was gone, and what replaced it looked different. In 1890, the United States conducted what should have been one of the most valuable demographic records in its history. For the first time, census enumerators collected detailed personal information. More than 60 million Americans were counted. The resulting archive would have been an extraordinary resource for anyone trying to understand the country during one of its most dramatic decades. Almost none of it exists today. In 1921, a fire broke out in the Commerce Department building where the records were stored. A portion of the documents was destroyed immediately. The surviving materials were moved into storage, where they sat for years without adequate preservation. Then, in a decision that still puzzles historians, the remaining records were officially marked for destruction. By the early 1930s, most of them were gone. The timing is striking. The 1890 census covered exactly the decades when cities were being rebuilt after the fires of the 1870s, when populations were shifting across the continent, and when monumental architecture was appearing in American cities at an almost inexplicable pace. Around the same time, something else was happening on an enormous scale. Beginning in the 1850s and running into the early 20th century, charitable organizations in northeastern cities began relocating hundreds of thousands of children. The program became known as the orphan train movement. Children were placed on westbound trains with minimal documentation. Many were not true orphans. Some had parents who were simply too poor to keep them. When the children arrived in new communities, names were sometimes changed. Family histories were simplified or erased. An entire generation of Americans grew up without clear knowledge of where they had originally come from. Historians have written about this program within the context of 19th century social reform. Poverty, overcrowding, and immigration all contributed to the conditions that created it. But when you place it alongside the census disappearance, the fires, and the rapid reorganization of American cities, the scale of it takes on a different texture. Hundreds of thousands of children redistributed, records left incomplete, a generation of Americans with uncertain origins growing up in precisely the decades when the country's historical record was already fragmenting. Here is a question that photographs from the late 19th century quietly raise. How were these buildings constructed so fast? Photographs from the 1880s and 1890s show American cities filled with monumental architecture, enormous domed courthouses, grand railway terminals modeled on ancient Roman baths, libraries and government buildings covered in detailed stone carving. These structures appear in cities that were, according to most accounts, still developing basic infrastructure at the time. Dirt streets and wooden storefronts sit in the shadows of buildings that would not look out of place in Paris or Vienna. The most famous example came in 1893, when Chicago hosted the world's Columbian Exposition. Built on the shores of Lake Michigan, the fairgrounds covered hundreds of acres and contained more than 200 structures designed in an elaborate classical style. Visitors called it the White City. Towering colonnades, vast reflecting pools, domes visible from miles away. More than 27 million people passed through its gates in 6 months.